talk today about John Rawls' paradox of public reason. The paradox of public reason emerges in his book Political Liberalism, but actually the problem starts with the account he gives in A Theory of Justice and in the papers leading up to that. So let me start there by explaining roughly the outline of A Theory of Justice. In that book, Rawls is developing a theory of justice based upon something like a social contract idea. Now, in any social contract theory, there are at least three components, vital components, that are necessary to understand the theory. The first is an idealized circumstance of choice. We have to understand under what circumstances people are constructing this contract, agreeing to it, developing it. And so we have to start with something that Rawls calls the original position, where people are making a choice of the principles of justice, the set of institutions that's going to govern their association. And in Rawls's case, we start with the conception of agency. What does it mean to be an agent of an action, for it really to count as your action? Well, John Stuart Mill says it has to be free, voluntary, and informed. First of all, you must choose freely. You mustn't be acting under coercion. Nobody else can be forcing you into this. Secondly, it's got to actually present you with a choice so that it's a voluntary action. If I sneeze, that's typically an involuntary action. I'm not choosing to do that. So this has to be a real choice. You have to be given a choice among alternative arrangements. And finally, this must be informed. You've got to be able to know what you're doing. And so Rawls requires something that he calls the veil of ignorance. You have to be perfectly informed about the general principles of economics, of sociology, political science, and anything else that might be relevant, like human psychology, to making a choice among alternative social arrangements. However, it's very important, he says, that you not know anything about your particular place in that framework. You might be fine, for example, choosing an absolute dictatorship if you get to be the dictator. However, the idea is supposed to be you don't really know. You're trying to describe something that would be ideal in the abstract apart from your particular spot in it. And so he doesn't want you to know where exactly you're going to fit in, what social position you'll have. He says, I don't even want you to know anything about your conception of the good. Now, that generates a certain problem, because we assume that the people around the table, if you will, in choosing a framework, in this idealized circumstance of choice, are actually agents of their action, so they do have a choice to make. They are free, they are uncoerced, and they are informed. But we also want them to be equal. They are equal participants in this. And the ignorance of our own particular situation part, together with the equality part, give us a conception of what Rawls calls fairness. When he says, I'm giving you an account of justice as fairness, the idea is we have an idealized circumstance of choice in which you are agents, in which you are idealized agents, and moreover, that is fair, in that everybody involved in this choice contributes equally, and without knowing their particular circumstances, their particular place in this thing, so they can't manipulate it to their own advantage. They are otherwise to be self-interested. They're making a choice on the basis of the social arrangements that would suit them. But now you can see the problem that emerges in trying to make this choice, because they are supposed to be making this choice independently of their own conception of the good. And you might think there's a tension here between that ignorance of their own conception of the good that they're supposed to display in order for this to be fair, and the idea that they're choosing out of self-interest. How do they know what their self-interest even is if they don't know what their conception of the good is? You might think that in order for me to know what's good for me, I have to know what's good in general. I want a good life for myself, and in order to make a choice on the basis of what would promote a good life for myself, I need to know something about what a good human life would be. I have to have some conception of that. And if that conception is ruled out, you might say, I don't even understand my own self-interest. Well, this is an objection that a friend and colleague of mine, Tom Sung, used to describe as pulling a rabbit out of a hat. Rawls is trying to pull a rabbit out of a hat, an ethical rabbit, one having to do with the conception of justice, out of this hat, which is nothing more than a conception of fairness. Fairness here We often use just and fair as synonyms, but in this case he means something minimal. I am choosing freely, I am equal to the other parties, I'm choosing from behind the veil of ignorance so that I don't know anything about my particular circumstances. But if I don't know anything about them, even my conception of the good, then what on earth does it mean to say that I'm acting out of self-interest? And how on earth can I get a conception of justice out of that? Now, the problem is not just the tension between the veil of ignorance and a conception of self-interest in those idealized circumstances of choice. It relates to the second essential component of any social contract theory, which is that I have to have some conception of rationality. I have to know, in other words, on what basis, on what principles I might choose. Now, I'm not asking what I would choose, I'm saying how I would choose. I have to know something about the criteria I would use in making a choice among alternative possible arrangements. But that too seems to depend on a certain conception of the good. After all, some people are risk averse, and Rawls's preferred outcome here depends on people being actually maximally risk averse in a certain sense. I might be pretty much impervious to risk, as the utilitarian is if that person just wants to maximize expected utility. Or I might be somewhere in between. But wherever I am on that scale, you might say that my tolerance of risk is something connected to my conception of the good. I might think of a good life as one that's pretty safe and secure. I might think of a good life as one that involves lots of adventure and risk-taking. And so I've got to know something surely about my conception of the good in order to make any choice at all, in order not only to describe these ideal circumstances of choice, but also to talk about how I would choose, on what basis, what criteria I might use, what principles I would use in making a choice. The third component, of course, is then what would be chosen. What would be the principles of justice that I would choose after I've got this idealized conception in that circumstance of choice, and I have some way of choosing. But all of that seems to depend on a conception of the good. So you might think, we don't get any determinate answer to the question of what I would choose, what principles of justice I would select to govern our association, unless I already have some conception of the good. Now this is the problem that Rawls recognizes in political liberalism. He looks at the situation and recognizes that there was something illegitimate about his setup in the theory of justice. He was assuming that we could actually select such principles from behind a veil of ignorance without a conception of the good. But he came to see that that was problematic for a couple of reasons. One of them is internal, and I've been stressing that aspect of it. How do I select, without some conception of the good, something of what he calls in political liberalism a comprehensive doctrine that will enable me to understand what a good human life would be? But there's another problem as well. People in an ordinary society, in a multicultural society, especially like our own, have differing conceptions of the good. They have differing comprehensive doctrines. Some people are conservatives, some people are liberals, some people are progressives. Some people are Christians, some are Muslims, some are Jews, some are Hindus, some are Buddhists, some are atheists. Now, in all of those variations, you might say, there are different conceptions of the good life. And people are going to be selecting, now not only as human beings, but also as Christians, as Jews, as conservatives, as progressives, and so on. And so all of those are going to shape not only the outcome, but if we look at it in detail, they're going to shape people's conceptions of what would be in their self-interest, what would contribute to a good life for them. And it's going to shape how people think about the process of choosing itself. How do they choose? They're going to manage the process of choice in different ways. They're going to use different criteria. They're going to rely on different principles. Some of that may involve how risk tolerant they are, but a lot of it is going to shape the kinds of goods that people want, not only in their own lives, but in a social order, to promote those goodnesses in individual lives. So Rawls began to realize that once we think about different people having different comprehensive doctrines and needing them in order to get any outcome concerning principles of justice, he realized it may be impossible for us to overlap enough on enough issues to actually agree on principles of justice. He talks about this in terms of an overlapping consensus. If there's enough of an overlapping consensus, then maybe we can agree on certain principles of justice. But if there isn't, if the variations in society become large enough, then, he says, we may not be able to agree at all. Now, this is not merely a conceptual problem, a theoretical problem for a social contract account of justice. It is also a practical problem. And Rawls says, look, there is a real source of instability in a society here. That kind of diversity of fundamental conceptions, that kind of diversity of comprehensive doctrines can lead to people simply not agreeing what a good human life is, not only in detail, but even in general. They may therefore not agree on what are reasonable political doctrines or political institutions to live under. And so if we think of people not only in Rawls's thought experiment, but in political life in general, selecting the principles and the institutions under which they would live, there may simply be no such agreement in such a society if there is not an overlapping consensus. Consequently, the variation in comprehensive doctrines, as well as the fact that the real practical choice of how to live, not just a theoretical choice of principles of justice, depends on an overlapping consensus, makes Rawls suddenly realize that the society he was describing in A Theory of Justice may not be a stable society at all. Given a background of people who have very different comprehensive doctrines that don't overlap sufficiently, it may be impossible to agree on principles of justice, on social or political institutions. There are many practical issues on which people with different comprehensive doctrines might well disagree. Some may advocate things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Others may deny that and insist on suppression of unpopular or undesirable opinions, things they consider offensive or damaging. Some people may support the right of people to make choices on their own, independent of authorities that tell them what to do and what is in their own good. Others may advocate paternalism, thinking that no, it's an important role of government to shape people into the kind of people they ought to be. Some may think that government ought to be neutral among comprehensive doctrines. Others think they've got the right comprehensive doctrine and should have government institutions encourage people, if not force them, to adhere to that comprehensive doctrine. So there can be many practical issues that emerge, not only very general ones, the kind I've been describing about the nature of the Constitution under which we ought to live, but also in terms of practical decision-making involving particular laws and particular policies. So if all that's true, Rawls says, it may be impossible to have a stable society at all. It may simply be impossible to agree on principles of justice. And he confesses it might be. There is no guarantee of stability, according to this way of thinking about things. A stable society is a fortunate outcome. It might not happen. But he says there are ways of encouraging it. Now, one way of encouraging it would be to say, have whatever comprehensive doctrine you like. Let it shape your own political and social views, your own conception of how you individually ought to live and how we ought to live together. But when you enter the public square and enter into political discussion, then those comprehensive doctrines have to be left on the side. There is no way to expect other people to agree with your comprehensive doctrine. And so, basically, you should have a religion-neutral, a comprehensive doctrine-neutral public square. Now, that is a conception that many people have. They really think religion has no place in public life, that it should be pushed to the side, that even if you hold things privately for that reason, you should not expect others to do so, and you should not base political arguments based on that. So you should have, as it were, a comprehensive doctrine-neutral political sphere. Now, Rawls himself thinks that's impossible. As he describes it, why should citizens in discussing and voting on the most fundamental political questions honor the limits of public reason? How can it be either reasonable or rational when basic matters are at stake for citizens to appeal only to a public conception of justice and not to the whole truth as they see it? Surely the most fundamental questions should be settled by appealing to the most important truths. Yet these may far transcend public reason. So we seem to face a dilemma, a paradox if you will. Not only the general paradox that if there isn't enough of an overlapping consensus among comprehensive doctrines, we won't have a stable society at all and people won't be able to agree about principles of justice, but also this problem that it seems as if we need for people, in order to get along together and have a stable society, need to discuss these things in a way that seems independent of particular comprehensive doctrines. And yet, it would be completely unreasonable to expect people not to make decisions on the basis of those comprehensive doctrines. They shape the way people view a good human life, individually and collectively. So of course they're going to base their reasons on that. How can you say you can have whatever reasons you want at the privacy of your own home, but don't bring them into the public square, don't use them in public argument? That seems bizarre. So we've got this paradox. Stability seems to depend on a kind of neutrality of the public square, a public reason as he puts it. And yet it seems completely bizarre to expect people to leave their comprehensive doctrines by the side when, after all, their conception of a good public policy and a good principle of justice, a good set of institutions, will depend on their own particular comprehensive doctrine of the good. So what can we do? Rawls's way out of the paradox is to recommend civility. We have to commit to respect other citizens' rationality. We have to agree that we're going to share a political community with them, not just in the short run at the moment, but over the long run. We have to recognize that in order to convince our fellow citizens, in order to persuade them that the policy we favor is the right policy, we need to frame arguments in ways that they can accept. Now, does that mean we have to exclude comprehensive doctrines, such as religious doctrines, from the public square at all? Well, no, it depends on our audience. If I am a Christian, for example, and I'm trying to persuade someone who is Jewish, we do have a significant overlap in our comprehensive doctrines of the good. They're not the same, but nevertheless, they have a lot of similarity to one another. And so I can rely on common aspects of those comprehensive doctrines. Now, if I'm dealing with somebody from a very, very different comprehensive doctrine, I may have to frame my argument differently and leave out a lot more. So if I'm addressing things to the public at large, it may be that I have to go with the least common denominator, and that will mean I have to make my argument as independently as possible from my own concept of the good, from my own comprehensive doctrine. However, if I'm arguing with this person or that person, we may share a lot. We may have an overlapping consensus about a lot of things, and I can make use of that. So Rawls is recommending civility as something that doesn't require an absolute neutrality in the public square. That might be both unreasonable to expect and also impossible. But instead, he expects us to respect other people's rationality and their comprehensive doctrines enough to frame our arguments in ways that can be accepted on the basis of the overlapping consensus that we have with them. Now that may suggest a fragmentation of the public square. It may be that I have to frame my arguments very differently depending on my audience. And he thinks I think that that's true. So it's going to be difficult for a general, let's say, political candidate appealing to the entire national electorate to make an argument that depends on a conception of the public good. That person may really, out of civility, have to frame things very neutrally. And yet that doesn't mean that everybody will. Some people are addressing a subset of that audience with their argument, and with the points they want to make, they can rely on the overlapping consensus they have with that particular target audience. I want to conclude with one last requirement that Rawls sees as part of civility, part of his recommended way of dealing with the paradox of public reason. People have to abide by a constitutional use of power. In other words, that respect for rationality, the rationality of someone who might hold a very different comprehensive doctrine, needs to be built into a constitution, and then people have to abide by the constitutional powers that are allotted to them. Presumably the Constitution here is going to be one that is framed not on a particular comprehensive doctrine, but instead on a conception of respect for rationality. So there's a kind of Kantian foundation here. I have to respect other people's moral agency. Not only is that an ethical requirement on me, it's a requirement for a stable society that manages to navigate the difficult waters that are created by the paradox of public reason. I not only have to try to frame my reasons in ways that my audience might support based on whatever kind of overlapping consensus, if any, I have with that audience. I also have to respect their right to frame arguments on the basis of their comprehensive doctrines. I have to respect their right to live according to their comprehensive doctrines. Now, of course, that doesn't mean somebody can have a comprehensive doctrine that allows them to do anything. They too have to respect other people's rationality and other people's choices about how to live. But that kind of neutrality and that kind of mutual respect, he says, has to be built in to the constitutional structure. So what emerges here is, I think, maybe another aspect of fairness, if I can put it that way. That fairness requires not only equality in the original position and those idealized circumstances of choice, as well as a kind of disregard for my own particular place. I also have to be fair in the sense that I allow other people to have comprehensive doctrines, conceptions of the good that are not the same as mine. And I have to respect their right to pursue the good life as they see it, provided, of course, that there is a basic condition of reciprocity met, that they also respect my right to pursue the good life as I see it. On the question of individual good lives, then, we need to respect one another's comprehensive doctrines. When it comes to our lives together, we have to try to persuade one another and do it on the basis of whatever overlapping consensus might exist, whatever neutral ground we can find. But it's important that as we do that, we enter into that discussion and seek to use means of rational persuasion as opposed to force. We cannot use power to force people into our conception of the good or into abiding by it. Instead, we have to respect their right to live according to their own comprehensive doctrines, provided that they also respect our right to live according to ours.